delighted to have Linda. I'm just going to, before I introduce Linda, I'm just going to say a little bit about the program, which is on your chairs, Palace Women. Some of you may have been aware of the first two editions of a program called Oltrarno Gaze, which Linda coordinated with support originally from Advancing Women Artists and a number of other people, and British Institute was involved, Il Marino Cultural Centre was involved. Anyhow, this is the third edition. It's no longer called Oltrarno Gaze, it's now called Palace Women, Oltrarno ed Oltre, Oltrarno and beyond. And it's a program of all kinds of events, exhibitions, concerts, lectures, walking tours, which are underway now and continue through to the end of November, more or less, I think. Yeah. And this lecture and one we're doing in November with Francesca Baldini are part of this program. And I want to acknowledge the supporters. We got a grant from the city of Florence, and there's a long verbiage which I'm supposed to say, but I can't remember. So thanks to the city of Florence for giving us some money. And then Alice Volger and Donna Malin, I think both of us tonight, thank you very much for your support of the program. And then Wayne and Margie from Calliope Arts have also come in to support the program. So we're very grateful to the donors who've made the whole Palace Women project possible. There it all is, including probably the right words. Yes, project. Okay, good. Thanks, Linda. I remembered most of it. Eh? Yeah. Anyhow, so and tonight's lecture, which Linda's going to give, is all about the female patrons in their beautiful villas and palazzi, which she'll tell us all about. So Linda, again, leads little introduction, but she actually sent me some notes. I'm going to give her a proper introduction this time. Originally from California. I didn't actually know that. So, hey, that's cool. But she's been in Italy for the last 28 years, between Bologna and Florence for the most part. She's a writer, a journalist, published several books. The most recent one, called Florence in the Making, was published in 2022. It's better when I hold the microphone close to my mouth. I apologize. And she also was the founding director of the Advancing Women Art Project, which she did for about 10 years until that came to the end of its natural life. And she's now working for the Calliope Arts and the Restoration Conversations publication. And she's a woman around at least 2 towns and involved in all kinds of things. And one of our regular lecturers, and it's a great pleasure to have you back, Linda Falcone.
Thank you so much, Simon. It is a pleasure to be back for me as well. I'm always really happy to be able to meet this audience and meet the audience following us from abroad, possibly, or from their homes. And Simon, you did my job. You introduced the Palace Women Project. I just wanted to share, those in the room have the calendar on their seat, and if you'd like to take a look, we have several events happening. One on Saturday, then we have one on Tuesday, in which we actually go and see the villas and palazzi, that some of which I'll be discussing tonight. But in any case, those who are not in the room can have a look at this website link in which they'll find the whole program. And I also wanted to extend my thanks definitely to project organizers, so Calliope Arts, the British Institute of Florence, and Il Palmerino Cultural Association, and our wonderful donors, 2 of who are in the room, Donna Malin and Alice Vogler, and also Margie McKinnon and Wayne McCardle, who are brought. So we shall get started. The idea for Palace Women actually came about because the old Oltrarno was home, the chosen home of Eleonora di Toledo. She, as many of you know, did not want to live in that unhealthy palace of Palazzo Vecchio. She did not want to live in Palazzo Medici Riccardi, and she decided that the Oltrarno was the area in which to raise her children, raise her growing brood with Cosimo I. And she played a great role in the founding of the neighborhood, because with the Pitti Palace that she purchased with part of her dowry money. And we know that she was fundamental also in the designing of the Boboli garden. But the fact that she chose to have her royal residence in the Oltrarno neighborhood, which was countryside, basically was the founding, the driving force behind the development of the Oltrarno Artisans Quarter, because they needed artisans to decorate the Pitti Palace. That is why a really important part of the Palace Women Project is supporting artisans. So primarily women artisans, we are trying within this project Palace Women to create a connection, as always, between women of the past, in this case, patrons of the past, women patrons of the past. Some of them are poets, some of them are artists, some of them are rulers, etc. We will see. But also invite artisans of today. And here we have Jane Harmon's hands, who's a woodworker here in Oltrarno and Oltre. And they are becoming inspired by the different palaces that we're discussing in the project and creating works of art ex novo, or works of craftsmanship ex novo, which will be exhibited at the end of October at Il Palmerino in a show. In the Oltrarno neighborhood, just to give you a real quick beginning, and we some of you may recognize this painting on the left-hand side, which is Casa Guidi. And we know that Elizabeth Barrett Browning came to Florence after she eloped with Robert, the love of her life. And she was fundamental in creating that impetus, the poetic impetus for the unification of Italy. And I'd like to suggest to you that oftentimes foreign women would come to Italy, particularly starting from the 1800s and in the 1900s, to enjoy freedom that they didn't enjoy in their home countries. And a lot of her poetry, Casa Guidi Windows, for example, discusses Italian identity and the quest for freedom, which on some level was certainly personal freedom. The other photo that we see here, the other painting we see here, it belongs to the studio of Felice de Fogò, who was an artist in the same period. She has several works you can see, for example, in Santa Maria del Carmine, still in this neighborhood. She has a work in Santa Croce. She did funeral monuments, but in Via degli Seragli, she had a studio. And something incredibly important about her is that her studio was developed along the lines of what Cellini tried to do. So she was considered a vestal of art. Cellini was trying to put together all sorts of craftsmanship, all different types of craftsmanship, and unite them in a single work. And in her case, you see the same. She works with engraving. She implements a lot of different techniques that are used for the creation of coins, for example. She was interested in heraldry. So I just wanted to put an artist and a poet to start our lecture off. We're actually going to be talking about Medici women tonight, but I did want to give you this idea that the Oltrarno neighborhood, which continues to be a creative center, has been a creative center for centuries. And we do have Eleonora di Toledo to thank, first and foremost. Tonight we will be discussing 3 Medici patrons, and you'll see here Anna Maria Louisa, Vittoria della Rovere, and Christina of Lorraine. And in understanding the Medici, I think something that I want to share with you is that the Medici women looked to their grandmothers, and the Medici men looked to their mothers. Okay, why do I say that? Because we have, and this is the family tree. Okay, this slide is to be our roadmap. Okay, because there are a lot of names, And so if we can really focus on these three women, Anna Maria Luisa de Medici, who was the granddaughter of Vittoria della Rovere, who was the granddaughter of Christina di Lorena, and not pictured here, we have Christina di Lorena, who was the granddaughter of Caterina de' Medici. Interestingly enough, all of these women lost their mothers either through abandonment, through early death, etc. We know that Anna Maria Luisa, her mother, went back to the court of France. Okay, as I said, there's a lot of names. So, Luisa Maria d'Orléans, Vittoria della Rovere, whose mother abandoned her to become the Grand Duchess in Austria, and Christina di Lorraine, who was essentially raised by Caterina de' Medici, and she was considered Caterina de' Medici's pearl. I also wanted to discuss another palace woman, Violante di Baviera, and funnily enough, I had put her with the other three. And then I heard the three Medici women saying to me, why did you put this imposter on our slide, right? Because Violante di Baviera was probably the only person in the city who was not happy to see Anna Maria Luisa, the only woman in the city not happy to see Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici return after her husband's death, when she returned from the court of Dusseldorf to Florence, because essentially Violante, who was the widow of Anna Maria Luisa's brother, was ousted from her position. And in order to calm the waters, Cosimo III, Anna Maria Luisa's father, the reigning Grand Duke, sent Violante to become the governess of Siena. But I do want to put her front and center because she is a patroness that is often overlooked. She certainly didn't have, let's say, the wherewithal or the strength, quote unquote, of a Vittoria della Rovere, perhaps of an Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, and certainly not of a Catherine de' Medici. However, there's an interesting quote, and she says, I am bold. I have a boldness about me, and I fear nothing. So with that, she and her reggia at Via Lampeggi is very important for us to evaluate today. So we're going to look at these certain palaces, have a glance, a glimpse of these palaces, and look at, well, in fact, villas more than palaces, Villa La Quiete, Villa di Poggio Imperiale, Villa La Petraia, and Via Lampeggi. And we'll see these women were linked to all of these villas, but in the story that I'd like to tell you tonight, well, I'd like it to develop as we go along. We are starting with Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici. So we're starting with a woman who to all of us has a relevance, which is the reason she is our common ground. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici is our common ground. She is immensely relevant to us today. We know her first and foremost for having created what we call the family pact. And a lot of you will remember, and I have always remembered it, as her gifting Medici property to the city of Florence after the death of her brother Giangastone. You know, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici is the last Medici heir. This was actually a photograph of an actress, which I covered for reasons of copyright. But I do want to tell you that I couldn't find, and to my knowledge, there's no existing painting or artwork of Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici signing the family pact. And if you do know of one, I'd love to hear about it, and I'd love to share it. So perhaps in the questions at the end, if you know of a painting in which we see women doing something, because oftentimes royal women particularly are shown in certain poses, etc. But it would be interesting to see if there was And that's a challenge I also want to give to artists today. If you're looking for a theme, why not capture Anna Maria Luisa de Medici in the act of signing the family pact? Here she is in Palazzo Pitti. It was actually signed in Vienna. And I brought up the text for you, and it is in Italian, because some of us like to look at the actual words in Italian and what she was promising or what she was bestowing upon her successor. Because this is interesting. She was not actually gifting the Medici properties to the city of Florence. She was gifting them to her successor, Francis Stephen, the next ruler, not of the Medici line, right? On the condition that Medici properties and riches and cultural wealth would not be removed from the city. And that is the key. It was actually a family pact, a pact between families. It was not a pact between Anna Maria Luisa and the state, because she did not have the power to take her properties from the successive ruler. But she did have the power to create a legally binding document that miraculously, right, essentially by the grace of God, we can say, was respected. Because we know of many other wills, particularly wills drafted by women, that were not respected to the letter or by any stretch of the imagination. Therefore, we have Anna Maria Luisa's farsightedness. She wants to bequeath these properties for the utilità del pubblico, so for the usefulness of the public, to attract the curiosity of foreigners, right? On the condition that nothing be transported, right, or brought outside of the capital and the state of the Grand Duchy. So this was signed in 1737 with Duke of Lorraine, Francis Stephen. And here I thought it's just an interesting piece of trivia to know that this was laid out in Article 3, and it was not actually written in Italian. This is the Italian translation of what was written in French and signed in Vienna. So we are looking at, because as you know, Italian was not yet the official language. It was the Tuscan dialect, and we have to wait for Florence to become capital of Italy in the 1800s for that decision to be made of Italy being, of Italian or Tuscan being adopted as the official language. I just wanted to say a word about Johann Carl Wilhelm, and this is to create the story and then introduce you to the actual palaces. It was actually a happy marriage, and so happy marriages should always be put front and center in history. They seem to be so rare. Cosimo III tried to marry her off to the powers of Europe, and she was not successful. But she ended up marrying the Elector Palatine, and in the historical archives it says they met, they sang, and danced together. Right? So how can that not be a successful relationship? And she loved him, and this is they did all sorts of paintings of them together, and this is them dressed in Spanish attire. And I particularly like this juxtaposition because on the one hand you see these two very regal figures in their, let's say, their ruler's attire, and then you have the two of them playing or in a playful stance, and certainly not imposing figures, right? And if we look at image, and certainly women were very careful, and this is a Medici prerogative, because the Medici, as we know, were very, very concerned with creating their image, and creating their image particularly through art, which is another reason why the city has so much wealth from this point of view, particularly in the form of portraiture, which before the Medici fondness for portraiture, it was a genre at the bottom of the art pyramid. Here we have Giangastone, and we have Anna Maria Luisa in her widow's weeds, and behind her we have her husband, which is quite a telling photograph. But you imagine she came back to Florence in 1717, and she basically reacquired all of her powers that she renounced when she married the Elector Palatine. So this is an exception in history, right? She loved her husband, but she didn't create lasting connections with the court in Dusseldorf. And she decided to return to Florence, her well-loved city, and she tried to help Giangastone. He was not, willing. He did not have a fondness for her. Obviously, their lives were absolutely radical opposites. She was very Catholic, very conservative, and he was a very controversial figure from several points of view. So we have Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, the last heir of the Medici, the childless heir, right? And we also have to mention, because it was the woman's duty, that was the woman's job, to be married and to produce a male heir, that I imagine the sadness that she must have felt, or the weight on her shoulders, that she was not able to produce a male heir. Neither were her brother, neither was her brother, Giangastone, right, or Grand Principe Ferdinando. But here we have Villa La Quiete. So for someone who wants quiet, right, Villa La Quiete, and I don't know if you're familiar with this particular villa. It's not very well known. It's a museum in the making. There are certain parts of it that can be visited. And in order to prepare for this lecture, because I'm a big believer in conversation as in people who are experts in these topics are the people we need to turn to. I obviously come at it from the project as a project coordinator of Palace Women. I'm by no stretch of the imagination an expert in these topics, but I do have the faculty of picking up the phone and talking to experts. And so the person that I talked to was the curator of Villa La Quiete, Raffaele Nicoli Vallesi, who talked to me about Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici in a way that was very touching. And he told me something that I didn't actually know, because we know about the family pact and Anna Maria Luisa being shown in writing in that way. But she actually wanted to live in Villa La Quiete. Villa La Quiete, this is an internal view, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. She had parts of the villa frescoed. It was a family villa. It was also much loved by her grandmother, Vittoria della Rovere. It was much loved by her great-grandmother, Christina of Lorraine. And Christina of Lorraine actually, in her will, speaking of wills, willed it to the Medici princesses. Well, that didn't happen, right? That didn't happen. Shortly after her death, and with the help of Vittoria della Rovere, it was sold to Eleonora Ramirez di Montalvo, who was a married woman who created this. It's not a convent, because they were actually laic nuns. We can't even say nuns. They were laic sisters. And Eleonora Ramirez, who in this fresco we have her presenting her ancelle, her damsels, to the Virgin Mary. A really strong figure, and a lot of the things that you can see now if you go to Villa La Quiete is part of the convent. The sisters of the Montalve, are known as the Montalve, still actually do exist. Something very special about the villa is it has not changed ownership since then. So essentially, since 1650, nothing has changed there. And why this is relevant to us, Vittoria della Rovere was an amazing patron as well, and she created the church. Here we have I'm sorry, I have a little bit of Italian in my mind, and so I'm having a hard time getting in English. I know this is the International Center, Simon. I need to get my English into gear. But yes, this is the monument in honor of Vittoria della Rovere by Fodini in the Church of Santa Trinita. They originally didn't have a church because they weren't nuns, and it was thanks to the Medici women that they finally were able to have a church of their own. But getting back to why it's relevant to us that the Montalve have been in the same place since the 1650s, they have something called I diari, so the diaries. And in these diaries, every day since the 1650s, they've written what has happened on a given day. So the diaries are filled, and the curator was discussing this with me, they're filled with stories and anecdotes of the visits of the Grand Duchesses. And so he gave a picture of Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici that I never would have imagined. She would bring jewels and trinkets to the students who were there, the sisters who were there. She would play jokes on them, for example. And when I say sisters, this was a center. Remember, they were not nuns. It was a center for noble women, education for noble women. And they would arrive at the ages from 3 to 5, and they would be educated until they were of marriageable age, at which they could then decide to be married, right? Or they could decide to stay on as Montalve. This is interesting because you have a lot of patronage that is happening, particularly with Vittoria della Rovere and then with Anna Maria Luisa, because it was the Grand Duchess's way to gain favor with these families. Because if these noble families, aristocratic families, have all of their women being educated in a convent, semi-convent, like La Quiete, right? The generosity and the gentilezza, so the delicacy and the kindness shown to these women was essential for political reasons, because then these women would marry into noble families, etc., and they would have an ally in the Medici, I mean to say, would have an ally in these families. So it was, and this is very important to women's history. We often don't have written documentation, but religious centers are centers for women's history. There's a story that Dr. Valesi told, saying that Anna Maria Luisa came to the Montalve one day and said, I'm going to have some of my ladies come here to live. So I'm going to prepare a wing for some of my ladies. And the Montalve said, that's wonderful, perfect. So after several months of work, she came to the Montalve and said, actually, those ladies that I was telling you about, yes, it's me. And Anna Maria Luisa moved in because she wanted to live with them. And she said, I don't want to be a disturbance to you, but I do want to be in contact with you. So you can imagine in a situation where she's not welcome at Palazzo Pitti and there's no affinity with Giangastone, her brother, she has no descendants, etc. Although she has the privileges of her rank, she doesn't have the continuance in history, and so she chooses to go to La Quiete and live the final years of her life, particularly from October to May. And here, the Montalve were so touched by this dialogue, this conversation, they had created for her this wonderful painting of Anna Maria Louisa as the Virgin Mary teaching. No, I'm sorry. Anna Maria Louisa as Saint Anne teaching the Virgin Mary to read. So this idea of female legacy, and she was very interested in supporting the education. The Montalve, as we said, they began in 1650. They continued for centuries until the 1980s, in fact. These are photographs from the 1800s, but it was an all-women's school. And I put this slide in because at a certain point, they called upon the monks at Santa Maria Novella and said, you have to teach us what kind of a pharmacy we need or a live-in structure or a boarding school like this one, because they had, you know, young people who were sick or who would die, etc. So the monks of Santa Maria Novella came to show them exactly what they would need in their pharmacy. And this is an exhibit that still is visitable today at La Quiete. Wonderful photographs of the education that these women received for centuries. And I wanted to show you in particular this photograph, which is again from the mid-1800s, but you see that they are studying art. So they have both a classical education, they studied music, it was a conservatory of sorts, they studied art, painting, but also the sciences and also mathematics. So it's very important to look at the education of women through history, and women supporting women in this role of creating a legacy for us. We're switching villas and going to Villa Poggio Imperiale, Villa di Poggio Imperiale. Also, another perhaps quote unquote little known villa or not often visited villa. They will be opening a segment of it come November. So keep that in mind and do continue to check perhaps on their website to see when there will be the possibility to visit it. Vittoria della Rovere essentially created her Villa La Quiete, although she loved Villa La Quiete, but she created her imperial palace in Poggio Imperiale. Here we have two images of Vittoria della Rovere, which are significant. On the one hand, you have obviously Cosimo III. Possibly you can see the resemblance between Cosimo III, you'll remember is Anna Maria Louisa's father. And on the other side, you have Vittoria della Rovere as Santa Margherita. You can see the dragon, you can see the attributes of the saint. And I wanted to look at these particular pictures, one, because, as I said before, the Medici men looked to their mothers, and there's a reason for this. Their mothers were very strong-willed on the one hand, but the mothers were also responsible for the Grand Duke's education. And part of their government was to educate the children. She educated Cosimo III in a very heavily religious way. Vittoria della Rovere says, my dowry is purity. Okay, and we know that she had a huge dowry, right, as the last heir of the Duchy of Urbino. So it was an amazing dowry that brought very precious works into the Medici collection. But in her feeling, her sentiment, she wanted to give candor. She wanted to give purity. And it was a very tight-laced education, totally opposite than what her husband, Ferdinando II, wanted to give his child. However, mom was in charge. Mom's in charge of education of the children. We'll talk a little bit about Vittoria della Rovere. She's known to history as, and in fact, in researching to come and talk to you today, it's actually amazing the amount of quotes and information. She is liquidated with, oh, she was a bigot. Oh, she was a bigot. And that's the end of it, right? There's wonderful scholarship that is coming out recently. And I would like to mention Adelina Modesti first and foremost, who is an incredible scholar, has recently published a book on female matronage, and Vittoria della Rovere. And she is actually the person that I talked to, the person that I had the conversation with about Vittoria della Rovere. And my question was, let's get to the bottom of it, Adelina. Why, right, is she liquidated as this horrible, bigoted figure? Okay. And I will share Adelina's answer with you as we move along, but I do want to share before that a quote from 1781 by Riguccio Gaduzzi, who says, "Pride, vanity, bigotry, intolerance. The public shows no sentiment at the loss of Vittoria della Rovere." We can argue it. We can argue it. In fact, I will argue it. I hope you'll accompany me. But I want to start with how Vittoria della Rovere arrived at the Medici court. She was, as we know, the last heir of the Duchy of Urbino, but she was also a Medici through her mother, who abandoned her at a very early age to become the Duchess of Austria. So we have Claudia de' Medici, who becomes that Duchess of Austria, Grand Duchess of Austria, and abandons Vittoria della Rovere, who is raised in a monastery of Crocetta here in Florence. So she is transported, I believe, when she was a toddler, to Florence and betrothed to her husband by will of her grandmother. Right? So Christina di Lorena wanted her grandson, because they were cousins. So Christina di Lorena wanted her grandson to marry Vittoria della Rovere. It was a way to expand the Medici powers in Italy. And it was also a way to, the Medici had spent a lot of time creating international connections. Okay. So you have the regency, for example, in this period of time, you have the regency of Christina di Lorena and her daughter-in-law, Maddalena, Maria Maddalena of Austria. They didn't get along. One, Christina di Lorena was interested in advancing France. Maria Maddalena was interested in advancing Austria and the Habsburgs, etc. Very strong-willed women. But they were regents to Ferdinando II. And they betrothed him to Vittoria della Rovere. He was 13 years older than Vittoria della Rovere. So at the age of 13, an adolescent, he finds himself essentially betrothed to a toddler. And their relationship was not a good one. They did not have love for each other. Certainly, they had 4 children. 2 of them died in infancy, and but Cosimo III was the child that then Vittoria della Rovere took charge of. After the birth of Cosimo II, he was, and Adelina tells me this is not historically documented, but it is hearsay, that he was found in a compromising situation with a page boy. So because of this pedophilic relationship, Vittoria della Rovere distanced herself from him, and their reconciliation took essentially 20 years. Therefore, she didn't spend a lot of time at Pitti, but instead she created, for our benefit, let's say, she created her reggia at Poggio Imperiale. So we have some inner scenes that I want to show you. But this is very important because it became a center for women's creativity. And that, I think, is the message that I want to relay to you first and foremost. Perhaps we are talking about a quote-unquote bigot. Adelina's take on it, to get back to that point, is that the religious realm was a realm in which women had power. So it was part of their role to found convents. It was part of their role to educate the public, and to Vittoria della Rovere was particularly interested in providing dowries to women who did not have dowries. She had, it's called the Festival of the Dowry. So she would receive thousands of letters through her agents, through her secretaries, and sometimes sometimes she would grant a dowry. Other times she would find legal representatives for married women who did not receive their dowry back after their husband died, because that's the clincher, right? When a woman gives her dowry, when she gets married, and when the husband dies and she remains a widow, she is to receive at least half of her dowry back. And sometimes the families would not, these noble families would not give their dowries back. So she was actually very well loved by women. And if you see the level of her patronage for women, and we'll get to slides on this discussion, but I just want to suggest to you that it is all conversation, right? And there were certain interests. Obviously, she was pro Rome. So now I'm not saying that perhaps it wasn't a time of economic difficulty during her regency. So when she and Maria Maddalena of Austria ruled the city, they are recorded in the annals of history as being, pompous and have spent too much. I tend to think that memory, that collective memory, is because they were women. Because why have we not remembered until very recently, until scholars like Adelina, why have we not remembered all of the patronage that these women did for women? Because it's an invisible page in history. This is a lovely photograph, a family photograph we have. On the one side, Vittoria della Rovere as a saint, an unspecified saint. And we have Anna Maria Louisa de Medici, granddaughter, with the governess, and with her uncle, because Francesca Maria, which is Vittoria della Rovere's second surviving son, was born 20 years later when the couple reconciled. Okay, so they were quite similar in age. And this is important to us because you'll remember that Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, Anna Maria Louisa's mother, abandoned the court, went back to France, which was a huge scandal. She got permission to go back to France. She essentially divorced him, right? Because she could not take the somber environment of Cosimo III, who was very, very much under the thumb of his mother, Vittoria della Rovere. Here we have Vittoria della Rovere as the Madonna. So I do want to suggest to you that the Medici men were not the only ones dressing up as the three magi, for example, with Benozzo Gozzoli. You have this idea of the sacred and the profane together. You have the idea of the Medici being semi-divine beings. And this we see from Vasari onwards, in which Vasari essentially talks about the Medici as being gods brought to earth. And so the woman's take on it, and Vittoria della Rovere really dedicated herself to creating an image in which she was perceived, or she wanted to be perceived as a holy woman. So we have her as Saint Victoria, we have her as Saint Helena, and my favorite as Celestial Venus by Justus Sutermans, who you'll remember essentially portraited her for the whole of her life, from the little girl picture that we saw at the beginning to the very end of her life. Now, here we get to this idea of, Vittoria della Rovere as unattractive, as bigoted, etc. Now, the fact that Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, and if you remember one thing about this conversation that we're having together, because I hope you'll also participate at the end, the one thing I'd like you to remember is the family pact, the idea that Anna Maria Luisa had did not come from nowhere. Consider that Vittoria della Rovere was the last heir of her family. And she had no power to keep the territory because the territory was male territory. The land belonged to men in history. In the Medici family, the Medicis and all of the rulers of Europe in this time period, the land belonged to the men. But the property and the palaces belonged to the women and could belong to the women and could be inherited by the women. So she brought with her to Florence the Titians and the Botticellis and all of the different works of art that from Venice, from Urbino, the Raffaello, I think it was 8 Raffaello paintings. What we see today in Palazzo Pitti is not only thanks to Anna Maria Luisa, it's thanks to Vittoria della Rovere. And I think she inherited it when she was 9 years old. And they brought it over immediately. The Medici brought her property over immediately. And this is very important because the fact that women could inherit mobile objects. And this is why Vittoria della Rovere was a patron of embroidery. She was a patron of craftsmanship. And she was famous of essentially identifying the talents of her ladies in waiting and finding if they knew how to embroider, if they knew how to paint, if they knew how to sing, she would get them trained and make sure that they produced something for posterity. Okay, this is just some inside views. The villa originally belonged to Maria Maddalena of Austria, who decorated it with different scenes of heroic women and heroic saints. Vittoria della Rovere then purchased it and made it into her own villa. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but this is a portrait of Vittoria della Rovere as Judith. And if the art buffs in the room can guess who painted this, can anyone guess? Or does anyone know? It's in a private collection. Giovanna Garzoni. Giovanna Garzoni, who in Pitti, we have wonderful still life works of fruits and vegetables and flowers. And one of the innovations that Giovanna Garzoni brought to still life works is the white background rather than the very dark background. And the Medici, you'll remember, and Vittoria della Rovere in particular, because she was a Medici and she wanted to also celebrate the glories of Florence, she supported flower painters because Florence, flowery, Firenze, etc. And this is Vittoria della Rovere, who received works commissioned. Giovanna Garzoni received works commissioned by Vittoria della Rovere because she wanted to celebrate Florence. And here we have Judith, which is the female equivalent of the David. So this is a big deal, right? This is an interesting miniature of Camilla Guerrieri, who, as you know, was an early painter. It's a fascinating, really rare type of work. It's a self-portrait with a double portrait of Vittoria della Rovere, right? Tiny, tiny piece. Camilla Guerrieri was another of the women that Vittoria della Rovere supported. And we get to today because we have a artisan who, and you'll have to come to the show to learn more, who is working on Poggio Imperiale in Vittoria della Rovere and designing a jewel in honor of this very interesting woman who is deserving of much more than being written off as simply a bigot, because she really did have very much a desire to connect with the women who were part of her entourage. And I will suggest to you that it is because there was the missing mother figure. So all of these women on some level are looking for female companionship, however their rank permitted it. This is a wonderful picture of Poggio Imperiale, because Poggio Imperiale also through the years, through centuries, has been a women's school. It continues to be a women's school, l'Educandato of Santissima Annunziata. This is a shot from recess in the 1870s. So I thought you'd also like to see what it means to continue to use these structures. And then we arrive at Villa La Petraia. Villa La Petraia, we'll be visiting Villa La Petraia, so do come, those of you who are in Florence. And Villa La Petraia was gifted to Christina of Lorraine the year of her marriage. And you'll remember that she married Ferdinand I. It also was a marriage of great esteem, and the period of time in which Ferdinando, who was a great diplomat and a very well-respected ruler, after having abandoned the cloth, he was a cardinal, and his brother, as we know, who was supposed to become Grand Duke or continue ruling, was killed in mysterious circumstances. And then Ferdinando I was married off to Christina de Lorraine, thanks to the very heavy intervention of her grandmother, Catherine de Medici in France. And the wedding celebrations actually lasted a month. And it was a huge pageant. This idea of Ferdinando I marrying Christina de Lorraine. And an interesting fact is that he, who was a cardinal and who renounced the cloth, was the one who actually crowned her Grand Duchess, and not any member of a senior official in the religious clergy, because he felt that he conserved his power from that point of view. We know that this is a fresco of Caterina de' Medici in the feasts of the Medici, and this is a tiny, well, it's not tiny, it's a large lunette with Catherine de' Medici's children, her daughters and her sons, and this was part of a section, not that Christina de Lorraine had actually, she didn't commission this. She commissioned another part. These are two photographs. I'm trying to go a little bit faster because I'm seeing that time's a waste in here. These were two elements of her wedding. They had the whole of the Pitti courtyard set up with a naval battle scene, and they brought in water and they brought in ships, etc. And an interesting fact is at Petraia they did performances, and she was very interested in music and opera, and she became, one of her roles in governing the house, in the governo della casa, was to be in charge of theatrical performances. And Christina de Lorraine was one of the major patrons of a precursor of opera, Francesca Caccini. And as we know, she was also a great supporter of Galileo Galilei. He wrote one of the 4 most important Copernican letters to Christina de Lorraine in order to discuss how science could play a role in the reading of the scripture, that they didn't have to be, that the Bible was not actually a scientific text, and it was never meant to be a scientific text. So to us, that may seem obvious, but it was not obvious, in fact. And he wrote the letter to Christina de Lorraine hoping to get support. She was very much in favor of the clergy, but she was also very interested in science. And you'll remember that Galileo Galilei, she was the one who hired him to become a tutor, particularly a math tutor for the young Cosimo II, who would become Grand Duke. And Christina was regent while Cosimo II became of age. And she was also regent with her daughter-in-law, Maria Maddalena of Austria, after Cosimo II died, because he was sickly, and then they had to wait for Ferdinando II to grow up, etc. I know it's a lot of names. Here's the family. Okay, we have Maria Maddalena of Austria, Cosimo II, Ferdinando II, and Christina de Lorraine. And Cosimo was also very much under the thumb, quote unquote, of the women in his life. At least that is how history remembers it. Certainly, this is a fresco in Villa Petraia, which represents Christina de Lorraine's ancestors, who were related to the taking of Jerusalem in the First Crusade, etc. So she loved Villa Petraia. It was actually a stone castle, almost a castle of sorts, or a fortress of sorts. And together with Ferdinando I, her husband, they transformed it into a modern day country home. And she loved fishing, she loved hunting, they stocked the pools, etc. So it's also quite fun to think of Medici women in an active way. And in order the Lord of the Toledo, we know, also loved hunting, she loved gaming, she loved gambling, etc. This is the courtyard, and we had a group of students as part of Palace Women. There was a grant program at the Scuola di Porta Romana, which many of you are familiar with, in which they are working, and they continue to work, also inspired by the theme Medici Women. So this is one of the reasons why I'm so really grateful for this project and grateful to our sponsors, because the importance of introducing young people to Palace Women and the idea of women history is so essential. These are scenes of Villa Petraia in its 19th century guise. It became the villa of the king's lover and later morgantic wife, La Bella Rosina. I'm rushing us through because I want to get to Violante di Baviera, because Violante di Baviera is, I believe, a touching figure. She spent a lot of time in Villa di Lampeggi. She was, and this is also said a lot about these women, both of Christina de Lorraine and of Violante. Oh, she was not beautiful. She was not beautiful. And so you read these historical texts and essays, oh, she was not beautiful, etc. And I just want to say one thing about the opera composer, Francesca Caccini, and Michelangelo Buonarroti. Christina de Lorraine commissioned an opera that he wrote the book for, and she composed, about a slave who was actually a Persian princess. And Christina de Lorraine said, have the people in the play react to something other than her beauty. And I just think that that's very important to say as well, and very important to remember. Violante loved her husband, Gran Principe Ferdinando. He didn't love her back. He was very involved with his musicians and his music and with his plays and with his various lovers. But he was very much a patron of the arts, and they found each other on that level. But the interesting thing about Violante is that she not only was a patron of plays, but she also acted in plays, and she created an entourage. This is her in her widow weeds. She was a patron of Giovanna Fratellini, who is known as the Florentine Rosalba Carriera. But I do want to mention, because she was the daughter-in-law of Marguerite Louisa de Orleans, who divorced Cosimo III. I hope you're following me. I've been working for 2 weeks to get all the names right, let me tell you. So if you can just make your best effort. This essentially, because she was the daughter-in-law of the woman who left, the woman who divorced, etc., who was a problem, who came from France, who had all of her French ideas, etc. Violante was not allowed to bring a court from home, and she was negated. She was able to have a handmaiden, a German handmaiden, and she was able to have a Turkish, I guess you would say maid, right? But she couldn't have a cook, and she couldn't have a personal doctor, and she couldn't have a personal confessor. So later tonight, I want you to think about that, right? Why those figures were negated to Violante. And she actually formed her own very young court of young people. And she would arrange all of their marriages. It was a way for people to sort of participate in a small scale aristocracy. But she was also a patron of the arts, and Giovanna Fraternini is one example. And in the Uffizi, actually in the Soffitone, which is the big attic, there are works, and 30 works by Giovanna Fratellini. They're pastels, some paintings of women. And she had her friends and her court ladies represented. And this was also very Medici oriented, because we know that the Medicis used art to create favor. So you have Violante doing that as well. It's a patrimony for women's history. You can tell, if they're married, if they're not, by their hairdo, by their neckline, etc. And there are women of various stature and rank. You have an opera singer, you have a nun, you have a noblewoman, etc. So it's quite interesting. They are in storage, and I'm going to end here and leave you for your part of the conversation, questions or comments that you have. And thank you for your patience with me, because as you know, this is not my topic of conversation, but I really did want to do the lecture on palace women, and particularly on the passing through of the legacy of women through their grandmothers. So thank you.
Yes. Just get a bit of light on so we can see each other a bit better. A bit more. Whoa, hello. Hi. Okay, so as always, we'll move to the questions and answers, and the Zoomers are joining us. Lots of you. It's very nice to see you all. As always, the rules are in the room. If you want to ask a question, you put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone so that the Zoomers can hear you. And then I'll also read out any comments or questions from the Zoomers in the chat. And also, Zoomers, if you want to, you can unmute and talk to us. But whilst I'm talking to Zoomers, I see Sarah has already put up the weekly reminder to make your donations. We loved having the Zoomers attending without paying up front, but we do also love it when the Zoomers make a little contribution. So just giving is there, waiting for whatever you feel that you are ready to give us to help keep this series going. Okay, I saw somebody in the front row wanted to get you started. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. I'm not sure I followed all of the names and lineages, but I had two questions. One is, why was the family pact not written in German if she came back from there? And that is, a known language at the time. And the second question is, where was the villa, the first villa you were talking about, La Quiete? Where's that located?
Oh goodness, that's a good question. I mean, I've been there several times. It's near San Domenico. Thank you.
So it's outside?
Yes, it's outside of the city. It's about 20 minutes from here. Yeah.
And the other question.
Yes, the language. My guess would be that French was the language of the educated and of legal documents. Yeah.
Okay, we have another one here.
Thank you for this fascinating lecture. In the portrait of Vittoria della Rovere as Judith, who is the head she's holding, and is there a story behind that?
Oh yes, Holofernes. I'm sorry, I didn't. Yes, when she's Judith, Holofernes. Yes, Holofernes, who was the general of the. It's a biblical story, right? In which Judith, who through trickery, etc., reaches the tent of Holofernes and is able to murder him, essentially. No.
It wasn't a portrait of an enemy.
It wasn't Ferdinand II, as far as I know. No.
So let's go to the Zoom comments. We've got a few here. Lots of complimenti. Please, you can tell us a bit more about the artist Guerrieri. I didn't catch his first name.
Camilla Guerrieri. No, she's an artist that has just recently been studied. This particular piece, this self-portrait, if I'm not mistaken, it was discovered in 2007, and there's not a lot of work that's being done. Well, there is. I mean, it's the Medici Archive project is a point of reference for Camilla Guerrieri, because I don't know enough about her to be honest, to be able to answer the question. So if you would like to be in contact with me, I can certainly put you in contact with someone who can tell you more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Aaron Patsiaksworthy asks, there's a Cecilia de Pazzi portrait by Fratellini in Palazzo Davanzati. Would that have been a Medici commission, even though she's a Pazzi?
Yes. That's a Violante commission.
Okay, so that
yes.
They were forgiven after a couple of centuries.
Well, I mean, did a lot from that point of view, right? Well,
absolutely.
Relationships, women did carry the relationships forward where men possibly could not.
More thoughts or questions or comment? Another one in the front row.
Well, thank you. You mentioned the works of art that Vittoria della Rovere brought from Urbino.
Yes.
Was it a double portrait of Federico da Montefeltro and his second wife by Piero da Francesca included in those works?
Yeah. Yes, there were several works by
Piero da Francesca.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any more? Anyone on the Zoom want to talk to us? Be brave. They sometimes do. Anything else on the Zoom? No, I think we're getting towards it.
I'd like to hear your views on this. Is this new information? Are these things that you have seen before, studied before? Are you surprised? Do you want to argue and say she was a bigot? Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry. No,
this is about the woman who was meant to be a bigot. What was it that your friend said about her? The woman that you spoke to about her? I'm not sure if you ended up saying.
Yeah, she said that it was a woman's role to have a role in religious environments, and in reality, she was very well loved by women of all sectors. So that's in her court and her patronage, etc. She was very well remembered by women, particularly, which I think is telltale.
Good. There's a magnificent turnout of women in the audience tonight. I'm most delighted to see you all here. Wondering if any of the men are feeling brave enough to join the conversation. Probably not. Anyway, it's your turn after centuries of the other way around, so it's all good. Okay, any more? Because it's getting towards wine time, I think.
I just do
Yes, I
want,
would like to, may I?
Yes, hello.
Yes, Linda, I would like to thank you, congratulate you. I have the video off, so I have a better connection for audio.
It's
I'm
Diane
halfway-
Archibald, everybody.
Yeah, I'm halfway around the world right now, so congratulations on your dedication and your perseverance in continuing the direction of the advancing women's artists goals, directives through new partnerships, and by continuing to focus on the histories, legacy of women and their contributions to Florentine and Tuscan life. It's appreciated by many of us. And I only wish I was there right now to participate in all the wonderful events that you have going on. It's excellent. Congratulations, complimenti.
thank you so much. Diane.
Thank you very much,
Really
Diane.
appreciate it.
That's Diana Archibald from Canada, who frequent visitors to Florence, heavily involved in the UNESCO City of Culture project and all the rest of it. Anyhow, so I think that's a really great note probably to wrap it up. Complimenting.
Thank you so
And-
much. Thank you.
And now for the women and the token men in the room, there's wine in the other room, which is comes to us from our seasoned partners, Castiglione del Bosco, decent wine from Tuscany. So see you all next week. Thank you very much. Bye, Zoomers. Thank you so much. Ciao, Zoomers. Thanks for your contributions. Bye.